So welcome everyone. It is December 26, 2015. We are in Cockeysville, Maryland. My name is Robert Sterne. I'm the oldest son of Joseph R.L. Sterne, who is the person we're going to be interviewing today in oral history that's going to span his professional career, his personal life, and his observations about the world and where things are going, and advice that he's giving to future generations. So this is the beginning of our video series, and I am here to ask questions, but essentially what we want to do is let him talk and explain whatever he wants to say. So, Dad, this is the way I'll refer to you. We're here in Cockeysville, Maryland. Can you tell us when you were born?
When I was born on April 25th, 1928, and that was a very important date. And the reason is it determined what my name was. My father had determined that I was going to be a junior. I was going to be Robert L. Sterne, Jr. And you will, if you test my 5 sons, you will not find any juniors among them. And I thwarted my father on the day of my birth by getting born on my grandfather Joe's birth date, which was April 25th, and therefore I became Joe, my grandfather Joe Heyman. And they made it easy by just putting my grandfather Joe in front of it, and I became Joseph R.L. Sterne, which became a very easy name for my readers to remember me during my professional career later.
So you were born in the 20s, before the stock market crash that we've all heard about. So can you tell us where you grew up and what your early childhood was like from the perspective of your later professional career, which we'll get into a little later in our discussion?
Yes, I was born in Philadelphia, and in Germantown, in the Germantown hospital rather, and that my earliest memories are of growing up in Wynwood. And I had an older sister, Barbara, and I lived in a nice white house on green grounds, and had a very happy childhood, at least until my 4th year, when my parents unfortunately divorced, and in a very traumatic and unexpected time, I found myself transported from this idyllic White House in Wynwood to an apartment in Germantown, Philadelphia, and I lived in an apartment and of my mother, my sister, and myself, and a maid in those days. So I was in an all-female household from the age of 4 until till 1939. And actually, I had a very wonderful time in growing up in Germantown because of my male playmates. I grew up with about 4 or 5 young guys my age, from kindergarten right through grammar school and high school, and we kept in touch till our mid-80s, when a few of us peeled off, but 3 of us are still in touch with ourselves a period of 80 some years, and I would say it was a wonderful period of close ties that were very, very important to us all through 7 or 8 decades.
So, so you had these early childhood friends that you kept in very close contact with through your entire life, and they were all from your neighborhood in Philadelphia, from what I remember. So, are you the exception or the rule in the sense of leaving Philadelphia and venturing forth outside of the Philadelphia environment? Did they stay in Philadelphia, or did they scatter around the country like many friends in the United States do?
No, they all stayed in Philadelphia except me. As soon as I graduated from high school, I went to college, and I never really returned to Philadelphia at all. I took up my profession, and that scattered me all the way around the country.
So you attended Central High School, as I recall, in Philadelphia, and then so you from there you went to college. So
Well,
can you explain your college experience and how you ended up at Lehigh University?
Well, first of all, I have to say something about Central High School. Central High School was an elite public school, and it was the greatest collection of overachievers I've ever known. And many of the graduates at Central High School went on to run Philadelphia, the medicine of Philadelphia, the politics of Philadelphia, the law schools, the law institutions of Philadelphia, and I met many people there that I kept in touch with too. And I then decided we all went through the process of picking a college, and through the influence of Sonia Haney and the Winter Carnival at Dartmouth College, I decided I just had to go to Dartmouth College. So in those days they had a very tight rule on Jewish boys of 2% to Dartmouth College, and I was heartbroken to be rejected by Dartmouth College, and I decided, with help from my father, that I should go to a school with a good business administration school, and I picked Lehigh University. And I went there, and I took half a year of business administration, because I came from a real estate family, and I assumed that I should carry on as a businessman. And after a semester, I called my father and I said, "Dad, I think I should take something practical." So I said, "I think I should major in English literature." So my father knew enough about me to know that as a businessman, I would be a terrible flop. And he said, "Well, you go ahead and do what you want." Well, Lehigh was full of engineers, and it was full of businessmen, business administration students, and us liberal arts students were few and far between in Lehigh. And I was just lolling around in my freshman year, and somebody came up to me as I was just looking around, and they said, "You're an art student, that's right?" And I said, "Yes." They said, "We're desperate for anybody who can write for the newspaper at Lehigh, the brown and white paper. So why don't you come around?" I said, "Well, okay, I'll do it, but I've never written for a newspaper." So they dragooned me into the job as a reporter. I said, "Well, I'll write a sports story." So I wrote a sports story, and I saw my name in a byline, and I was hooked at that time. So that's how the happenstance of getting rejected by Dartmouth, getting accepted by a crazy school for a guy of my inclinations at Lehigh, and it determined the rest of my life. And so soon I was writing away and neglecting most of my studies, and eventually became an editor at the paper, and neglecting a lot of my studies because I really didn't have much interest in Shelley and Keats and Wordsworth, and but I was sure and heck interested in the newspaper. And when the paper announced the new president at Lehigh on a Saturday, we even organized the staff and turned out a one-page special edition. And I thought, by the golly, this is the most wonderful thing anybody could possibly do in life. And that determined what I wanted to do. And in my junior year, I said, well, let's try magazines. So we organized a college humor magazine, and one of the writers I was able to do wrote a story that absolutely enraged the combined clergy of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where Lehigh is located. And the Board of Discipline decided that they were going to expel the writer. And they called me before the Board of Discipline and said, Tom Harris has to go. And I said, well, if anybody has to be expelled from the school, it's not Tom Harris, it's Joe Sterne has to be, because the editor is responsible for every word in the paper or the magazine, and not the writer. And that caused a great deal of consternation, because that destroyed the plans of the Board of Discipline. So they went into a huddle and said, all right, Mr. Harris won't be expelled, but we're going to have to do something. So we're going to say that you cannot be on the staff of any Lehigh publications until you, for the rest of your time at Lehigh. And I said, fine, I'll go back and start studying a little bit. And that was when I decided to bend down to my studies, and I graduated Phi Beta Kappa. And then I paid attention to what I should do for a job. And I applied to the Philadelphia Bulletin. And I got an interview with the managing editor of the Bulletin. His name was Walter Lister. And I went in and I saw him in the middle of the city room at the Philadelphia Bulletin. I said, Mr. Lister, I want you to know that I did not major in journalism at Lehigh. I majored in English literature, but I was on the staff of the Brown and White and the magazine. And he looked at me for a minute, and he leaned forward and he said, do you think I give a goddamn about what you did at Lehigh University? I said, if you want to get in the newspaper business, you go out and get it on a job like on the Wilkes-Barre or Pottstown paper and learn a little bit about what a newspaper really is and come back and see me in 2 years. And that ended my interview with the Philadelphia Bulletin. Well, thanks to my father, who knew somebody, who knew somebody, who knew somebody, they said, we have a job open on the Salt Lake Telegram for a cub reporter. And I found myself with a job offer on the Salt Lake Telegram. And I had never been west of Pittsburgh. And I thought, well, I'm going to try. So I got a 39 Buick, and I drove out west, and I got as far as Denver, and I didn't realize that when you get up to the Rocky Mountains, you better do something about your carburetor. And it was the 26th day of June, 1948. And I didn't think anything about snow or blizzards, and so on. I started going up Route 40 west of Denver and found myself in a blizzard. And the car was creeping along like this, that it was going to die every time. And I knew that I couldn't back down a 2-lane high road back to Denver. Somehow or another, we kept going, and I got to the top, and then I was able to coast downhill down to Vernon, Utah, and saw the good old state of Utah for the first time, and made it to Salt Lake City and got up to the place where Brigham Young looked out on the Salt Lake Valley and had said, this is the place. And they have the This Is the Place monument. And so I went there and I reported in on for my first job in a real newspaper. And I found that I love the kind of people who worked for newspapers. And I found people who were very gentle with me and helped me, coasted me along, as it taught me to do a little 1 paragraph or 2 or 3 paragraph about a church meeting or a Boy Scout meeting or a small obituary or a parade. And gradually I was doing a little 1-piece, 2-piece, 3-piece, and finally I got to the point where I was sent to write about a parade, and I even got to the point where I was writing a lead story on the front page of the Salt Lake Telegram about a fire in a hotel. And I made friends, and I found a great deal of friendship among newspapermen who had shared my love of newspapering. I worked there for almost a year, and then I wanted to get back and get into the Columbia School of Journalism, and I left a little bit of time left, and I went with a college friend on a student trip to Europe, and I was able to wangle a spot on a newspaper junket through post-war Germany in 1949. And believe it or not, I was all of 21 at that time, and we went and saw Berchtesgaden, and where Hitler, that was the place where Hitler looked out on the Alps and planned his last great stand. And we flew the airlift to embattled West Berlin, and where American planes were landing every 5 or 6 minutes, or maybe even 3 or 4 minutes, bringing coal and food to the people of West Berlin. And I was able to see Germany and Berlin in rubbles. This was when I was only 21, and then I went back to my college buddy and just went around and did some sightseeing in Western Europe, and then I came back to New York and went to the Columbia School of Journalism, which I found a complete waste of time, because the way to learn to be a newspaperman was not to go to school. The way to be a newspaperman in those days was to get a job on a newspaper. That's not true today. The demands on a newspaperman today are much more tied in with technology of communications. And today the Columbia School of Journalism is known as the Paris Island of newspaper schools, journalism schools, among those in the United States. They're really terrific. But in those days, I thought they were a bit of a joke. And I spent a good deal of time at the Columbia School of Journalism in the back of the orchestra at the Metropolitan Opera, and enjoying opera and enjoying the wonderful, wonderful things of New York City. And I learned too late that the thing to do when you want to go to really and enjoy yourself is to go to Columbia University and live for 4 years in New York City. And that's what Paul Sterne, my second son, did. He went to Columbia and majored in economic history, and that was a pretty good idea for him. In fact, he met Anna, his wife, at Columbia. So after getting out of Columbia, I was handed a job at the Wall Street Journal. Well, let's be honest about it. I was not interested in business news at that time, and I did a deplorable job in my first job offer at Columbia, at the Wall Street Journal, and frankly, I was more interested in wooing my wife than in working at the Wall Street Journal. And I got married to my wife after I had been switched by the Journal to the Dallas Bureau. And right after I got married and got back from my honeymoon of 1 week, I was fired by the Wall Street Journal, saying that I really wasn't doing the job that they had planned for me. And as a matter of fact, the Wall Street Journal was absolutely right in firing me, because I wasn't really interested in covering the kind of business news that they wanted me to do. So here I was in Dallas, Texas, newly married with hardly a penny to my name, and I got the most important job I ever got in my life. I got a job on the Dallas Morning News, somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody, and I applied, and they gave me a job. And I found I was delighted to go back to work with a regular, normal American job, American newspaper. I found that the kind of journalism at the Dallas Morning News was the kind of journalism that appealed to me. It was also a newspaper that practiced a kind of newspapering that it was as good as any I had ever encountered. They stressed good, clear writing, typewriting, and writing quickly under deadline by some of the best newspapermen I've ever met. The city editor was a guy by the name of Jack Kruger, whose very existence depended on a fresh cigarette every 15 minutes and a cup of black coffee every 20 minutes, and a very vigorous demands on his reporters, and I just loved him. And he one time practically sent me skyward because he had bawled me out several times on some of the things I had written, and then he turned over to me and said, "One of these days you might even be a good newspaper executive." And I thought he was kidding me, but I decided I tucked that away in my back pocket. And I worked there for 3 years, and I covered the federal courts, I covered the police districts of Dallas, I met some very lasting lifetime friends there, and I loved everything about it except the city. The city was not my cup of tea, and another factor was my father was not in very good physical shape, and I felt a need to get back to the East Coast. And I decided to look at the coverage of newspapers during the 1952 election. Luckily, the Dallas News in its library subscribed to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Baltimore Sun. And during that election, I read all three of those papers. And to my surprise, of the three papers, the Baltimore Sun was by far the best coverage of the campaign. It had, as the reporters of that campaign, fellows I was destined to meet and know and admire. Philip Potter, Howard Norton, and Tom O'Neill. And so I wrote to the paper's managing editor, Charles Dorsey, who I was going to learn to know as Buck Dorsey. And without the resources I really didn't have, I drove up to Baltimore, and I saw the assistant managing editor, and they turned me down. And a half a year later, I applied again, and they turned me down. And the third time, I went up there, and they gave me a job. Now, Dallas in those days was a gleaming new city. Baltimore was a rundown eastern city, and it was also the city that became the birthplace of my first son, Robert, named after my father. And he experienced a very rough childhood because we couldn't afford a car in those days. So we did have a childhood wagon. And Barbara and I, once a week, would put this poor child in the wagon, and it had slats, and we put him in the slats, and we'd walk him up to the supermarket and put our groceries around him, and then walk him back to the house, which was, of course, was not air conditioned, but we did have a system where water would drift down the outside windows, and we would blow air across the dripping windows, and somehow or another we all survived in this little house. And so there came a day when we got in the car and we left Texas forever. And so he was born a Texan, but he was not ever to be a Texan, Robert was. And we went up to Baltimore, Maryland, which became my beloved city eventually. And so at the age of 20, well, it was 1953, I was 25 at that time. I got my job in Baltimore. And you should have seen the look on his mother's face. She had left the gleaming, clean Dallas, and she liked Dallas. And we, in those days, the major street from the south into Baltimore was on Washington Boulevard, and Washington Boulevard was lined on either side with old, decrepit row houses. And she looked there, and she didn't say anything. And but we did find a nice houses to rent on the northern side of the city, and there we lived for 4 years. And during those 4 years, I covered the police districts, all the police districts, and I covered the city council, and I covered the courts, and the paper for some reason gave me wonderful chances because I learned a lot about newspapers on the Dallas Morning News. And I covered the General Assembly, I covered the state government, I covered a very flamboyant, wonderful Republican governor, Theodore Roosevelt McKeldin. I covered a very flamboyant Democratic mayor, Thomas D'Alessandro, whose daughter became Nancy Pelosi, who became the first woman Speaker of the House of Representatives, and the old system of politics in Baltimore was just a classic thing that put to shade any old kind of politics that you could imagine. And I loved it all the time. And I should say that the Baltimore Sun in those days was a very prestigious paper. It was kind of a little New York Times, where it attracted a great number of reporters from around the country because it had a large Washington bureau, and it had a goodly number of foreign bureaus. So Baltimore Sun was considered a breakthrough paper where journalists could get not only local local assignments and state assignments, but Washington assignments and foreign assignments. And one fine day, I was on my beat in City Hall, and I got a call, Mr. Dorsey wants to see you. And I said, well, I'm very busy, and I can't see him. Kind of laughing way of saying things. He said, well, I'll see him when he gets in to write his stories. So on that day, I walked in to his office, and he looked up at me, and he said, how's your British accent? And at that time, it was 1957, and he said, I'm going to send you to London. Just think of that. I was only 28 at the time, and I was going to be sent to the London Bureau, which dated its inauguration in 1922. And it was like being knighted at the Baltimore Sun. Suddenly you didn't have to worry about your 15-cent trolley fares or anything like that. You were told you can book on the Cunard line, first or second class, whichever you wanted, and unlimited expense accounts. And the only thing is, you could take your family, which by that time included not only Robert, but Paul and Edward. So 3 little boys, but they would have to go with their mother alone because your father, Mr. Buck Dorsey, didn't approve really of wives and families. They had to come 3 months later. And so they had to plan on coming alone, and I had to go alone to London and find a place to live. And here I was with included with some of the top scholars of the New York Times and the Washington Post and the New York Herald Tribune, and introduced to guys who were stars of the coverage coverage of the war, World War II in London, and so it was a really wonderful thing to suddenly be in London, and at the age of 29, going down to 10 Downing Street for chats with the Prime Minister and the American Press Corps in London. And so life was kind of living a very dazzling part of it. And that was all before the age of 30 for a guy who had never dreamed of being a newspaper correspondent. And it was before my time in Washington, where I spent the 1960s in Washington.
I want to talk about how there were bombed out churches that you would see when you drove down to Fleet Street. I want to talk about that. And I want to talk about the Tube and the Savoy Hotel and all that, just let's bring in some real color commentary, okay? Like, what was London like in '57? How strong was the dollar? Were they still using the old British currency of pounds, shillings, farthings, and all that stuff? How much of Victorian London was still around? I remember a lot of Victorian London was just alive and well in the 50s. It was amazing. It was like going back in time.
And the taxi.
Yeah, the black
taxis.
The black cabs, not taxis.
And the double-decker.
Double-decker buses. So, and the passports. Excuse me, the passports. I just realized that's where my passport is. Oh. Okay, Robbie.
Okay.
Okay, are we ready, boys?
Yeah,
Henry?
we were recording all of that. Go ahead.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Well, you can put it in the outtakes.
Yeah.
Good. Are we back on?
Yeah. Let's go.
So we have been talking about your rise in the newspaper business, and at the age of 30, you find yourself having been through this amazing experience going from Dallas to Baltimore to London. So I want to take you back to London, 1957 through 1959. Tell us, what was it like to be a reporter in London, on Fleet Street, in London at the height of their empire, before the African countries, for example, had received their independence? What was it like at the tail end of the British Empire when they ruled the world all the way around because of their navy and because of their global presence? What was it like to be a newspaper reporter in that era in London?
Well, that period was a tough one for a Britisher because that was right after, a couple of years after the United States had pulled the rug under the British Empire by intervening when the British and the Israelis had tried to seize the Suez Canal, and President Eisenhower more or less said no way. And there was great bitterness in Britain that the United States had not backed Britain during the Suez adventure. And because of that, the United States was not very popular when I went to London. And Prime Minister Macmillan's task was to somehow reestablish the United Kingdom as a force to be reckoned with in big power diplomacy, having been humiliated by the United States in the Suez adventure. So while I was over there, he was engaged in diplomatic methodology in trying to intervene as a party that the Moscow would have to deal with and the Washington would have to deal with, in dealing with the whole business of the Suez Canal and restoring Egyptian control of the canal at that time. It was a very big deal at the time. And what it was, from the British standpoint, it was to tell the world that Britain still had to be dealt with. After all, they had more or less had to acquiesce to the loss of India and Pakistan. And so it was the part of the withdrawal from empire, and Britain was very much involved in preparing the African countries for independence. The French had already very angrily given independence to Guinea in Africa, and the British had politely acknowledged independence to Ghana, and there would be many, many more over the next 10 or 15 years in Africa. So this was part of the end of colonialism, European colonialism in Africa and in the South Asia and North Africa. So Macmillan had the very, very difficult task of having been involved in the British blunder of thinking the United States would sit back and let India try to, in letting Britain try to reestablish control over the Suez Canal. And that was very much the diplomatic scene that he dealt with in U.S. policy, and how to somehow gracefully reestablish the special relationship between Britain and the United States, and that was really the basis of British diplomacy. So I had to deal with that. And as far as being a Yank in London in those days, it was glorious for the Yank because Britain was cheap. It's hard to believe because Britain today is and London is one of the most expensive cities in the world for an American. But when I was there, it was cheap, and the dollar was wonderful, and you could get cheap seats in the best theaters, in the best restaurants. You could get, if you had dollars, you could get wonderful antiques. Unfortunately, I didn't have many dollars, so I couldn't buy wonderful antiques, but I sure could go to Tottenham Court Road and in a Pakistani restaurant and get a wonderful Pakistani dinner for about $1.80, and I could go to the best theaters and see a wonderful theater for $5 or so, and I could go to Rule's restaurant or Simpson's in the Strand and get a wonderful, wonderful first-class British meal. So at the same time, if you wanted to walk along Fleet Street up towards Piccadilly or someplace like that, you saw bombed out sites since the war. In spite of the passage of time, ruins of churches that had not been rebuilt, rubble everywhere. You can see a town that still had not recovered from the ruins of war. On the other hand, you had wonderful black taxis and double-decker buses, and the underground was very, very inexpensive, and you had the old pounds, shilling, pence system of money. I remember when I came back from my years in London, I had to translate items in American stores from dollars and cents back to British pounds and pences to understand what the value was, and it was a very, very Victorian city, and the air was terrible. It was filled with grit of low people heated their homes with little low stoves. Your mother and I had to dry diapers on little lattice works, which we placed on top of these coal fires, and put the diapers on top of them to dry them out. And so we had to, and there was no such thing as a central heated house. That was something that only very, very rich Americans could pay for. And one of the things that one of my successors in London showed that he was a much better businessman than I was. I was paying exorbitant rent for a very drafty old house. He went out down in Chelsea and bought a fairly new house and bought it, and it went the price of the house zoomed way up through the roof, and the paper made money out of his purchase. So what I should have done when the day I arrived in London, I should have gone right out and bought a house, the first thing, with the paper's money, of course.
So you're in London in the 57, 59 time frame, and of course that's not that much after World War II, which ended in 1945. So tell us about some of the politicians that you met and other world leaders, and about de Gaulle coming back to power. Fill us in on what was going on while you were there as a reporter.
Well, I think the paper missed missed a chance. Buck Dorsey didn't realize the advantage of flipping over to Paris in an hour. And I happened to be there at the time of great political unrest in Paris. And de Gaulle had been out of power for several years. People thought he was finished. And I kept saying, I think we better take a look at the situation in Paris. We did not have a Paris bureau, and we should have used it as though we were a Paris bureau. And Dorsey kept saying, if de Gaulle moves, go to Paris. So I thought, well, there was one thing to do with the managing editor on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and that is to ignore him. So I decided nothing was doing of interest in London at the time, so I just took a plane to Paris, and I checked into the Hotel Crillon, where every self-respecting American reporter would go, and I sent Mr. Dorsey a little short telegram aping his words, and I said, de Gaulle has moved. And of course, at that time, tension was rising because de Gaulle was of the political right in Paris, of course, and the left was very much upset at the possible. So de Gaulle was waiting for his moment, and there were crowds of protesters on the left and protesters on the right. And I remember the chants, and the chants from the right was de Gaulle au pouvoir. De Gaulle au pouvoir means de Gaulle to power. And the chants from the left was in French, was de Gaulle to the guillotine, but I forget what it was in the leftist chants. And so you had the French police they didn't have billy sticks like American cops, but they had capes, and at the bottom of the capes were leaded and swept like this. And you didn't want to, even an American reporters did not want to collide with the cape. So we had to stand in recessed windows and watched the show. And de Gaulle actually did come to power, and the leftists was the right said de Gaulle au pouvoir, and the right was de Gaulle au battoir, au battoir. The battoir was the guillotine. So you had the wonderful French things of de Gaulle au battoir, and the other was de Gaulle au pouvoir. And one of the best stories I did when I was in Paris, I went to a small town outside of Paris, and I asked the French, I had an interpreter, and I asked the people what they wanted from de Gaulle, and they said, we wanted peace. And they didn't care what the right wing or the left wing wanted. They just wanted de Gaulle to restore the power to the. They wanted him to restore power, and it was a good peace. It was exactly what happened, and I got a lot of praise for that piece, and then I was present in the General Assembly of the Fourth Republic, and it was the final, last hurrah, the Fourth Republic, and I wrote about the collapse of the Fourth Republic, which was a very emotional thing, as the Fifth Republic under de Gaulle took power, which was a great thing for France for a while. Later on, of course, de Gaulle's mandate expired too, like many things happen in politics. So that was my big moment in France while I was serving in my assignment for Britain. And in Britain, one of my thrills was to go for the first time to the House of Commons and the press gallery there. And while I was there, by luck, a pause swept over the chattering of the members of Congress, of the House of Commons. And this was caused by the entrance of Sir Winston Churchill. He, by that time, was not an active member of the leadership. And as he came in, a sound I have never heard before or since. It was kind of a low, it started out like a very low, and it grew and grew and grew as he came and quietly took his seat in the front seats of the right of the Tories, and until he came there and sat down, and the front row of the Tories sat down. But it was really something to see that mark of respect for Churchill, because don't forget, Churchill for years was the battle of the Tories, and he also was the battler of the Tories who broke with Chamberlain and the appeasers of Hitler. And so there was decades of history trailing this chubby old man as he came in and sat down on the front rows of the Tories. And to see Churchill was to see everything that I was aware of since my childhood, my first childhood, come into the House of Commons and sit down was something quite unforgettable. So those were priceless moments to witness as a young man of 29 years old.
So you mentioned Churchill. Did you ever have a chance to go to Chartwell, and were there American tourists in England at that time, or was it pretty much?
Well, Churchill always didn't have a lot of money. That's why he wrote all his life. He was a journalist. Don't forget, he made his reputation as a journalist in the Boer War, and he made his reputation even after the World War II with his monumental histories of the World War II. And so this was always very much a part of it. And when he lived in Chartwell, one of his hobbies was brickwork. He built walls of red brick, and he opened the Chartwell to visitors, which he charged for his for attendance, and so he used his hobby to allow them to see him laying bricks. And he came out and smiled at his visitors, and your mother was with me when he was doing that. And but my last sighting of Churchill was on his last outing, seeking a re-election to the House of Commons, and it was in a little constituency north of London. And let's face it, Mr. Churchill needed a constant supply of brandy through many years of life. And I think he had a plentiful supply that evening, and he got up and made a few remarks, and a young socialist got up and asked his representative in the House of Commons a very complicated question about some pending bill in the House. And of course, Mr. Churchill was not prepared very well to respond, and he was just being baited by this wiseacre member of the Labour Party, and the people in the audience were mostly conservative Tories, and they were ready to tear this young Labourite to pieces, and they howled this fellow into silence. And so that ended his speaking career, I think, in politics. And it was quite something to be there at the end of his career. Needless to say, I was in awe of Mr. Churchill.
So it's 1968, turmoil in Washington, D.C., and now you're heading off to Europe. Why did you want to go to Europe, and what was the challenge there?
I had been studying the Cold War ever since I could remember. And I had always wanted to cover it where Germany was divided, because I felt that was the important part of the whole issue, was what to do about Germany. In fact, what to do about Germany has always been the question of Europe. And you can go back to Bismarck, or you can go back to the settlement of the 1815, and all through the whole 19th century, and on to the First World War and the settlements of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Hitler and everything. It goes all about what to do about Germany. And so I was totally interested in the whole business of Germany. And I thought that unless I was there and experienced it, and experienced Poland, and experienced Romania and the Balkans a little bit, I wouldn't understand enough. So my only regret was that I hadn't studied the German language. And that was a very serious handicap, which I never really overcame. And but I did feel that I studied enough German so that I could read a German newspaper, and I could understand a German newscast during my time. And I did learn a lot about the politics of Germany all through my 3 years in Germany. So I feel that I was wise to devote myself for 3 years over there instead of learning more about American politics by sticking to Washington throughout. And I think I did learn an awful lot about German politics. And I had some, I learned almost all I ever learned about Poland by having visited there. And I, as I look back on it, it was a wonderful 3 years of my life. And I also think it was a very good thing for for some of my sons. It certainly helped Paul in he learned German language almost on a colloquial basis. And Adam's work with Bosch was enhanced a lot by being a bilingual in handling the language there. So that had, and of course, it taught my firstborn son, Robert, how it felt to be in the control of the East German police for a certain time. That happened when I was covering an East German party congress, and like many American reporters, it was much easier to get the transcripts of the East German party and filed our stories in West Berlin and get a courier to bring us the transcripts across Checkpoint Charlie by way of a courier. And so luckily we had a perfect courier for us, the son of one of the correspondents of the American reporters in West Berlin. His name happened to be Robert Sterne, and we sent this boy, who didn't know any German at all, since he had been studying at Tufts University while his family was in Germany, and he had come over for the summer holidays. So we sent this poor child through Checkpoint Charlie, and we sent him over about 5 times to get the transcripts and bring it across the border. And by the time he came over the 5th time, the East Germans were starting to get very antsy and suspicious. So they took this child and put him in an empty room and made him think he was under arrest and so on. And they made him sit there and wait, and searched him and questioned him, and before they finally, after a traumatic test, let him go. And we were all ready to send out a message to the American authorities that they were holding this American child under false pretenses at Checkpoint Charlie. And so we finally got him free, and ever after that he was a violent anti-communist. And so that was one of the most serious things that ever happened to him. And another time we took one of our children across the border between East and West Germany on a passport in which one of the kids was listed and the other was not. And as far as I think, the Germans were thinking we were taking one boy over and on a 2-person passport and planning to sneak a East German child into West Germany, and his mother and I had to assure them that we were not trying to sneak an East German child over. So we were having all sorts of problems with the East Germans. And but I learned an awful lot of German history and German problems in there. And also, as a correspondent and a friend of the the German, of our embassy in Bonn, I was able to take our publisher on a helicopter ride in the entire length of the wall when it still existed between the east and west parts of the divided city. So that was another thing that I was able to do that was not open to very many people. So I learned a lot in being over there for 3 years. I also had the chance of seeing Willy Brandt in action. Willy Brandt was a young socialist who fought Hitler, refused to go along with Hitler, and escaped to Scandinavia during the war, and became a leader of the anti-Nazi resistance of the German people, and emerged from the war as a leader of the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and eventually became the first social democratic leader of West Germany, succeeding Konrad Adenauer, who was the automatic social Christian democratic leader of West Germany. So he was elected only 4 weeks after I arrived in Germany. That was a very crucial thing for a West German chancellor of the Socialist Party to be elected in Germany, and that turned Germany into a genuine two-party system. And so I learned and had frequent contacts with him and with Helmut Schmidt, his successor, who was very well respected around the world. So among the leaders of the world that I met as a reporter, Schmidt and Willy Brandt, and eventually Helmut Kohl, the Christian Democrat, were all people, leaders of Germany that I met over a period of 15, 20 years that I got to know very well. And among the leaders of the world, I managed to meet King Hussein of Jordan, because I happened to be in Germany when Germany was the only place a Western reporter could get into Jordan during Black September, when the Palestinian refugees living in Jordan tried to overthrow King Hussein, and we were able to fly on a U.S. plane, hospital plane, from Frankfurt into Jordan, of all places, and I spent a week trying to learn a little bit about the Middle East, and was one of only a dozen non-Middle Eastern reporters able to get into Jordan. So you never knew what you were going to be doing as a foreign correspondent anywhere in the world, or wherever you were. So it was a great time to be a foreign correspondent.
So when you were in Germany, and you were not just in Germany, you were going to other countries. Did you meet any other leaders outside of Germany in the Eastern Bloc, for example, that you want to make any comments about? And also, what was the perception at that time in the Eastern Bloc about the United States and about the Soviet Union?
Well, first of all, let me talk about Poland. I never knew any Polish official who wasn't a subversive. Everyone I ever knew hated the Russians totally. It was very understandable. If you're a Pole, you have Germans on one side and Russians on the other, and you hated them both. And but you had to have a job. You had to have and if you were educated, you had to preach the job line that gave you a job. So when I went to Poland for the first time, this Polish government assigned a guy who was supposed to help me and guide me along. So of course, suddenly he was my best friend, and when I decided I wanted to go to former Breslau, a part of Germany before the war that had been turned over to Poland, and I took the train to Wrocław, which had been German Breslau before the war. There was my minder. But the minder became a friend of mine, especially since I had a nice bottle of whiskey. And soon he was telling me all about the real Poland. And I listened, and I was very careful not to get him in trouble, ever. And after Poland had become free, and the wall had fallen, and he had become over to New York and got a visa to try to become an American citizen. I even tried to help him get a job in New York. But the important thing is that you always had to realize that you mustn't get these subversive Poles, you mustn't get them in trouble. And that was true of East Germans. East Germans were often real Germans. They really believe, only a German could believe Marxism anyway, because Marxism had to be concocted in a German mind. So I always had to be very, very careful not to get East Germans in trouble. And so if you were in East-controlled, Soviet-controlled, or communist East German control, you had to be very careful not to get your minders in trouble. And you must understand that you mustn't be naive about politics in Eastern Europe in those early days, before the war fell, before the wall fell on that glorious November 9th, when I wish I had been there to see the wall fall.
So Helmut Schmidt was considered by many to be the consummate, educated bureaucrat who became head of Germany. What was your perception of him, and what was your perception of his view of United States politicians?
Well, he thought that the American way of choosing a president was stupid. He thought that, he said very, very bluntly and without telling you it was off the record, he said the Americans continuously elect presidents who are not prepared to be good presidents. And when he became president of Germany, West Germany in the beginning, he had been president of Hamburg. He had become party leader of the Socialist Democrats in the Bundestag. He had been secretary of the equivalent of Secretary of State. He had been the equivalent of Secretary of the Treasury. He had been the equivalent of the Secretary of the Economy, or the head of the Federal Reserve. He had been the equivalent of the Secretary of Treasury. He would, in short, he had been prepared over 20 years to be Chancellor of Germany. And instead we had elected the governor of Georgia to be President of the United States. We had elected a former movie star to be President of the United States. We had elected people time after time after time who were not prepared to be president. And I think if we consider some of the people who are running for president on the Republican side this year, they're not prepared to be president of the United States any more than two of the people who are running on the Democratic side. They're not prepared to be president of the United States. So I think that he feels that the parliamentary democratic system in Germany, or in England for that matter, generally speaking, prepares people better for the presidency or the prime ministership or the chancellorship than we do in our country.
So after your 2-year stint in London, which ended in 1959, could you describe for us what it was like to come back to provincial Baltimore, Maryland in the late 50s under Dwight Eisenhower?
Well, I really didn't come back to provincial Baltimore because I let them know that I wanted to be assigned to the Washington Bureau of the Sun, and I think that they thought they better let me go to Washington, and so I began a period of the 60s, mainly in Washington. But actually, before I started really concentrating on Washington, I had gotten a call. I always used to have very important calls from Buck Dorsey, my managing editor, God bless him. And this always would occur in the late evening, London time. And what had happened was that in the late 50s, a lot of statesmen from Africa had come to London as part of their agitation for independence. From Nyasaland, from Rhodesia, from Zambia, from Ghana, from many, many countries, Kenya, Uganda, and most of my colleagues in Washington paid very little attention, in London, paid very little attention to these African leaders. I didn't. I went and met them and talked to them and asked them about their aspirations, and did quite a bit of coverage, especially about Nyasaland, which was having a lot of riots at that time. Nyasaland became Malawi. And we had some coverage out of that other newspapers were missing. So Mr. Dorsey said, okay, you can go to the Washington Bureau, but I want you to go to London, to Africa first. He said, you can bring your family back to Baltimore, and then I want you to go to Africa. Well, what Dorsey really wanted was I would go back to Washington and get visas, which were very difficult to get. And actually it took me over a month to get enough visas, including visa number 1 from the brand new country of Mauritania. It turned out that I went to Africa for 6 months out of a suitcase. 6 months, the toughest 6 months of my life, out of a suitcase. And I had skin problems, tummy problems, communication problems, and wrote my head off. And was in the Congo when the Congo blew up, and I was in the Congo when riding a helicopter when it was hit 8 times by bullets. Right, I'm searching for a Belgian plane that had been shot down and was lost.
Was the Belgian plane the one with Dag Hammarskjöld on it? Was the Belgian plane the one with Dag Hammarskjöld
No.
from the UN on it?
No. It was just I was living in Brazzaville on the other side of the Congo, because that was where it was possible to get communications to Baltimore by way of London. And I went out to the Brazzaville airport, and where I knew that U.S. helicopters were based, and the U.S. helicopter pilot asked me if I'd like to go looking for the Belgian plane, and of course I said yes. I would always like to go on with the U.S. helicopter looking for Belgian planes. And luckily the 8 bullets that hit the plane did not hit the roll lighter. And so we did get back safely, although one passenger did get a piece of shrapnel on his forehead. And I, of course, told the New York Times guy in Brazzaville that all about it, and that it's a shame that I would have to have a scoop on him. And needless to say that my story was on the front page of the Baltimore Sun, and the next day the Pentagon canceled further U.S. flights. And the following day, Mr. Dorsey sent a wire saying, "I think it's about time for you to come home." And somehow or another, I'd never received that wire. And the next day, Mr. Lumumba, I had seen Mr. Lumumba come when King Baudouin from Belgium had come down to the Congo to present freedom to the Congo through the good works of Belgium. And Lumumba had denounced Belgium for its a century of atrocities and exploitation, and the next few days, Lumumba had invited the international press to the Governor General's palace, and we came in there and sat on beautiful gilded chairs. And before the Mr. Lumumba came in to welcome us, a patrol of Lumumba soldiers had come in with rifles, surrounded us all on the outside of the room, outer room of the, pointing the guns at us, at the foreign press. And then Lumumba had a press conference, protected from the vicious press from assassination, which didn't come. And that was how crazy the whole world was in those days. And so that was my 6 months of the greatest assignment I ever had as a newspaperman, was going through 23 countries in 26 weeks. And it was an amazing assignment, and I saw great people like Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, and Kenneth Cowan of Zanzibar, and I went up to Timbuktu, and I went to Zanzibar, and saw a bewildering number of things, and went down to Cape Town after the massacre at Sharpeville, when the Afrikaner killed a lot of Africans who had protested the apartheid system. So you can imagine that was something. So that when I came back from Africa, Dorsey gave me 6 weeks off. And then I went up to the UN where a record 15 countries, I think it was 15 countries, became, including many of the leaders I had seen in Africa, joined the UN. And then I finally became an American reporter covering American news when during the last part of the 1964 election. When I was covering mostly Barry Goldwater.
So before,
I'm covering an awful lot of time.
yeah, so before we get to Barry Goldwater in 1964, take us back to the Kennedy administration, civil rights movement, Robert Kennedy, all the civil rights activities in the South, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs. What was it like to be in Washington during this time frame when you had so many world events just piling on top of this fresh, young, very inexperienced in many ways president and administration that was comprised of the best and the brightest, to use David Halberstam's famous book. Tell us what it was like to be in Washington during that Camelot years.
Well, when do you want me to start? Well, let's see. Let's talk about John F. Kennedy. When John F. Kennedy was campaigning for the presidency, I was still in Africa. I think I was in Gabon somewhere, lost, and I didn't even hear about it until his nomination had been news for 2 days. So I came back into the middle of the campaign, and they thought he needs a little bit of decompression. So I covered Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the vice presidential running mate of Richard Nixon. I think that's right. And he was the laziest of all the candidates, so I was able to catch up on my sleep somewhat, and nobody really gave a damn what he had to say. And then the campaign came to an end, and Philip Potter, the great Philip Potter, had been covering John Kennedy, and like a lot of people in the press corps had fallen in love with John Kennedy. I had never managed to be that smitten, but Phil Potter came up to me on the night of the election and said, "All right, I'm going to India. I've wanted to go to India, and you are taking over John F. Kennedy. And you're going to go up to Hyannis tomorrow morning, because Kennedy is having a press conference the day after his election." And we didn't believe that reporters needed much sleep when they're covering John Kennedy. So I went up there, and in the middle of this raucous press conference in Hyannis, Philip grabbed me by the arm and to go over and meet Mr. Kennedy. So I went over and I had said, "Congratulations, Mr. President." And he said, "Thank you." And he said, that was about it in all the turmoil. And the next time I saw Mr. Kennedy was about 4 or 5 days later at the Kennedy compound in Miami, the Kennedy compound there. And he had invited the traveling press corps to have a swim. So like others, we all kind of casually, but still very definitely, got in a kind of a slow little line to go and say hello to him. And I was in the line, and I got up to my point, and I said, "How do you do, Mr. President?" He said, "Well, Joe, how do you like this beat?" At which point I realized why he was President of the United States. Anybody who could get elected and meet 10 million people a day and see some obscure substitute reporter for Phil Potter and remember his name, explain to me why he was President of the United States. So I then became part of the White House press corps, which I hated a bit because I felt like I was just a part of a herd of people being ordered this way, that way, this way, that way. And but I was one of those poor, bedraggled, frozen people who had to stand outside of Kennedy's house in Georgetown waiting for him to tell us that Dean Rusk was the Secretary of State, or Mr. McNamara was Secretary of Defense, and all that kind of stuff. And then to wait for the inauguration. And that was the most spectacular inauguration because Washington was buried under snow, frozen snow. The whole place was just unbelievable. The whole U.S. Army was on duty all night long shoveling snow. And there was a very limited number of people who were on the presidential platform for the great inaugural speech. And I was one of the press pool was allowed on the presidential press pool, allowed up on the pool with Kennedy, but of course we had no assigned seats. We were just up there and we were to find what we could do. So the place was wet, damp, cold, grit and snow. So I looked around and I saw my friend Hubert Humphrey. So I went over and I said, "Good morning, Mr. Senator Humphrey." And I said, "You don't mind if I sneak right in front of you and kneel down and and nobody will see me and nobody will hear me?" And so he allowed me to kneel down in front of him. And while I made no noise, he kept making funny noise and jokes all during the ceremony. And to this day, I wish I had had a tape recorder to get Hubert Humphrey, not to get John F. Kennedy, which the whole world could do. But if I had only had Hubert Humphrey's words during the thing, I would be the happiest man on earth. But he was good old Hubert Humphrey, the laughing, the happy warrior. And that's how I heard Mr. Kennedy say, "We will lift any burden in defense of freedom." The most ridiculous statement ever made by a president. And then, of course, we had to get there and write our stories. And I was then supposed to go to the president's balls the next day, but I didn't know how to handle a white tie affair, because I never would. So Jerry Griffin, bureau chief, was very put out with me because I didn't go. I couldn't figure out how it worked. One of the few times Jerry Griffin forgave me. And then we had the whole business of Camelot. And I was on the press pool, on the press, I covered the White House for a while. And Jerry Griffin realized I hated the beat. I hated being one of the people ordered by the Jim Haggerty or Pierre Salinger or whoever happened to be in charge of the White House. And Jerry finally said, "Why are you unhappy?" And I said, "Because I want to be on the Hill and pick out my own stories and see my own sources." And he finally let me cover Congress instead of the White House. And I was then a very happy warrior. So that goes into another phase of my life.
So,
Unless you want to do something about the death of Kennedy.
well, before we get to the death of Kennedy, can you take us back to the civil rights movement? Did you cover any of the civil rights movement, or were you on the Hill before the Kennedy administration, the Kennedy assassination? So how did that play out? And what senators and what congressmen, now that you were on the Hill, did you befriend, and who, and can you give us some insights as to who the towering leaders were of that era?
Well, civil rights just consumed the country. And I covered the congressional side of the Civil Rights Bill, the debates about it, and to some extent I covered the Civil Rights Bill itself. When James Meredith was to be enrolled in the University of Mississippi, for example, we were all covering it from the Bureau. And I went down I flew down to Memphis the day before he was to go there, and rented a car, and it was very spooky. I drove from Memphis down to the University of Mississippi, and arrived there the day before he was to come there, and came into that something out of Gone with the Wind, with the white columns and the red bricks and the old boys just lounging around, and And Charlie Whiteford was our lead reporter, because he covered civil rights in Maryland. And so he was told to stick there for the actual attempt to bring a Meredith on campus, and he was actually on there during the battle. I was sent down to Jackson, Mississippi that night to cover the governor of Mississippi. So I actually was not there during the gunfight, but I was part of it all. And when Meredith was, they allowed a pool to see Meredith 2 days later. I drew straws and saw him. I was the only reporter to see him, and didn't get much of an interview or anything. So I was very much a peripheral reporter on the civil rights. Most of the time it was interviewing senators and congressmen and members of the civil rights coming up to the Hill, and especially after James, after King was killed, they were all up there, and I was part of the mob reporters questioning them. But I was only one of a huge number of reporters. I can't say it was a specialty of mine, but I did cover the Poor People's March and Resurrection City all the time. That for that whole week I was in Resurrection City and writing about it.
So we're moving around in time. When was the Resurrection City event, and can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that came after the death of Martin Luther King. He had scheduled it, and then his successor led it, and I can't tell you the exact date.
So before we deal with the Kennedy assassination and what was going on the Hill that day, tell us a little bit about the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, where it came very close, according to recently revealed information, that we almost went to nuclear war. What was Washington like during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Can't help you. I can't help you because I was covering Rockefeller and the Rockefeller Goldwater contest for the Republican nomination in '64, and I was not in Washington.
So we have the Kennedy assassination in November of 1963, and anybody who lived through that remembers exactly where they were when they heard the news. Can you tell us where you were and what was happening when you heard the news?
I was covering the Senate, and I was at the Senate press table in the Senate restaurant when the news flash came in. And we didn't bother paying our bills that day. I confess, there's a debt on my conscience to the Senate press gallery. And I ran down to the Senate. The Senate had been in session when the word came. Teddy Kennedy was presiding over the Senate since he was a junior member of the Senate, and they usually imposed the task of presiding over the Senate to the junior members. He was presiding over the Senate when some press, a junior aide ran up and whispered to him that his brother had been shot. And he didn't do anything, he just ran from the Senate. And somebody, I don't know who it was, took over. And I ran onto the floor of the Senate with about 4 or 5 other reporters. And Senator Mansfield was there, and Senator Dirksen was there. The Senator Mansfield was the Democratic leader, and Senator Dirksen was the Republican leader. And they were talking quietly and going at and looking at the teletype machines. We didn't know whether the president was dead or not. And I went and talked to both senators because I knew them very well. And one of them said, "We want to see the Senate chaplain." And the Senate chaplain came in, and Senator Dirksen turned to him in very deep voice of his and said, looked him in the eye and said, "How soon can you be ready?" And the Senate chaplain looked at him and said, 5 minutes. And he walked away, and even then we didn't know whether the president was alive. And he came back, and they convened the Senate. And we still didn't know whether the president was alive or dead. And they introduced the Senate chamber chaplain, and he said a prayer, which is in the Senate congressional record for that day, and then Senator Mansfield adjourned or suspended the Senate for the time being. And the next day, the first page of the congressional record had a black band around it, and that's all I know. And then the question was, how the hell do we get to our offices, because every taxi in town was commanded it almost. But somehow or another, 4 or 5 reporters and I got a taxi, and I went into my bureau in the National Press Building, and I went up to Jerry Griffin, the bureau chief, and I said, "It's hard to believe." And he looks at me and he said, "I'll tell you something else that's hard to believe." And I said, "What?" He says, we don't have a staff-written obituary of the President of the United States. And I looked at him, I said, yes, sir, and walked out and went to my typewriter, and I didn't stop till 2 in the morning. And after that evening, I gave up cigarettes.
You mentioned just now that you've quit cigarettes after the Kennedy assassination. There were a lot of people in the United States smoking cigarettes in the early 60s. What made you quit cigarettes right after the assassination?
Well, I always knew they were bad for me. When I was about 10 years old, I went to a boys' camp, and the headmaster of the camp told us way back, before we had the Commissioner General of the United States telling us how bad they were, he said, you must never, ever smoke a cigarette. But at the same time, they had us making strips of copper and pounding them into ashtrays to take home to mommy. So I got mixed signals because everybody in my family, mother, father, stepfather, stepmother, grandmother, grandfather, everybody smoked. And once I remember going to the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore, and I was looking at an ad about Art Deco jewelry, and of all the jewelry and China objects, and they had pieces showing cigarette holders, cigarette boxes, cigarette ashtrays, cigarette, all kinds of things for holding cigars, and I said, there was a big industry. So I was surrounded by it.
So we've had the Kennedy assassination in Washington, and now we have the powerhouse of the U.S. Senate, Senator Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, the accidental president, taking over from the Kennedy administration. And can you describe for us what it was like in Washington in '64 and '65 when Johnson just swept the nation's capital?
Well, I think Johnson's mastery of the Senate was probably the greatest in the history of the country. He had become master of the Senate, as if I might quote one of the titles of his biographies. At a very early age, after he had moved from the House to the Senate, he knew the rules. He knew how to twist elbows, and he just knew how the tricks of leadership of the chamber, and he knew how to get his way. And I think he was, no other man could have gotten through the civil rights bills that I have ever heard of, because he was a Southerner, he was a Texan, and no other senator could have done it. And his location, his will, and his willingness to give up the solid South for the Democratic Party was the trick that made it possible. And he got in terrible trouble over Vietnam, and he knew that he was forfeiting his reputation for years and years and years by doing that. And it's one of the tragedies of the 60s that that Vietnam destroyed his tremendous achievements in the presidency. And as I look at history of the United States, the two tragic figures of that particular era are Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. These were presidents who had tremendous achievements, and yet their reputations followed them right to their own graves, and their reputations have yet to catch up to what they did as presidents before they were consumed, by Watergate in Nixon's case and by Vietnam in Johnson's case. And I think that it's going to take another century before historians who have not been consumed by the emotions of their own times have been able to assess what they actually did.
So we're in Washington. The Great Society is being created by Johnson in the 60s, and now we see the rise of the anti-war movement in Washington. We see civil unrest based on civil rights issues. We have Martin Luther King and all of the tumult of the 60s starting to build around 65 and all the way up to the assassination of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King in 68. Talk to us about what it was like to be on the Hill during that time.
Frantic. Every day was just unbelievable. It was a time that I can't compare to anything else. The whole when Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, right after after King was killed, the whole country just didn't know what to do about it, and the whole country was filled with an emotional supercharge that destroyed any possible way to make a rational assessment of what really was happening. And I felt that way very much during the time. And the press itself was consumed with that. The press assessment of Bobby Kennedy, for example, was something I've never seen before or since. The press went gaga over Bobby Kennedy, and it was almost impossible to find an objective assessment of what was happening. And um, I think the reassessment of the 60s is going to go on till the 60s of the next 60s, 2060, and on, because I think that is an era that screams for reassessment and is already beginning.
So in 1960, many Republicans claimed that Mayor Daley from Chicago stole the election from Richard Nixon and gave it to the Kennedys. Whether or not that's true or not, Nixon was out, Kennedy was in. And Nixon then ran for Senate in California, and everybody had written him off by the mid-60s, as I recall. So tell us about your relationship with Richard M. Nixon.
Well, strangely enough, of all the politicians I dealt with, Nixon was the only president that I really got to know fairly well. And it happened this way. Nixon did lose to Governor of California, and he was written off. And he assessed the situation, and he decided that although he had said you would not have Nixon to kick around anymore, by 1966 he decided there does seem to be something to do about it. And he decided that he was going to go all around the country and do good things for local Republicans. And most of the reporters said, okay, let him do it, but don't ask me to cover him. And something told me this is not a good idea. And I said to Jerry Griffin, I said, I'd like to cover Nixon, the guy who's solely lost. So I found myself signed up to cover Nixon with just a very few reporters who did it sporadically, but I did it regularly. And I found myself sitting next to Richard Nixon for quite a long time, with plenty of time to talk. And I was preparing myself to go to Germany in a couple of years. So we started talking about politics in Germany. And to my surprise, I found he knew everybody who was everybody in Germany. And his assessment of the political situation was uncanny. And I thought, this guy really knows foreign affairs. And on the last day of the campaign, I was on a Learjet with Nixon, knee to knee with Nixon, flying from New York to Cummins, Indiana. And we were talking politics, we were talking about foreign affairs and so on. We landed at the Cummins, Indiana. He was going to look at the Cummins, Indiana thing and make a speech. And when we got there, an aide ran up to him and said, the rumor is that Lyndon Johnson is going to go on national television to urge people to vote Republican in the off-year election. And he turned to me because he didn't see anybody else he knew, and he says, we agreed that neither of us would make a national appeal. But all of a sudden his eyes lit up. He could see Lyndon doing that, and then he would get a chance to claim a speech. So he says to me, he says, if that son of a bitch goes on the national television and urges a vote for the Republican candidates, I'm going to demand equal time and I'm going to kick his balls off. Well, luckily, or unluckily, or whatever, Lyndon Johnson, it was a false rumor. But I could see the real combative Richard Nixon then, the ultimate warrior. And I remember during the campaign, I saw my old friend Werner Renberg, who was a fellow reporter of mine on the Dallas Morning News, and I talked him into going with see Nixon to make a speech in Brooklyn. And Werner Renberg will attest to this, that I said, you know, this guy's going to run again for president. And by golly, he did. He ran, and not only that, he won. And I made thousands of bad predictions of politics in my day, but that was one that I was right.
So we've got the assassination of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King in '68, and Washington was at a frenzy, as I recall, with the riots and cities burning and anti-war demonstrations, and it was crazy. What was your reaction as a member of the press corps? What did you decide to do?
At what point?
In '68, when did you decide you were going to head out of town and go to Germany?
Well, I had done that earlier. I'd wanted very much to cover the Cold War on the front line of the Cold War. I'd always wanted to cover the Cold War at the front line, where Germany was divided. And I wanted to get an assignment that would allow me to cover Poland and Romania and Hungary. And at the time I thought I would also have a chance to cover Czechoslovakia, which I was denied a chance to do that because the Russians wouldn't let any American reporters into Czechoslovakia after they had overrun Czechoslovakia.
So let's stop.
Yeah.
We're going to stop for now for dinner. Okay?
Yeah, because it looks like my batteries on this camera just died.
Can we charge them while we're at dinner?
Yep.
Good.
Frankly,
Okay.
I was really exhausted by American.
Well, you need to say that. That's what I gave you the softball.
Yeah.
We'll bring that up after dinner.
Now-
So Joe, I'm reading this book by by Robert Gates.
Yeah?
So in 2008, the Strategic Air Command takes off a B-52
Mm-hmm.
from North Dakota.
Yeah, I heard about this.
Right.
Yeah.
And they had 6 warheads that were nuclear.
Mm-hmm.
So it lands in Louisiana at the big.
Well, they didn't know where they were.
Yeah, right.
Like they did an inventory back when they were shipping them. Like, oh yeah, wait, where are these?
Right. So then about 3 weeks later, the Taiwanese notify the Defense Department that they have opened up a box of helicopter batteries. Okay, so let's go to more personal stuff. You've been writing an autobiography, is that right?
A memoir.
A memoir. And what prompted that? And what's the experience been like?
What prompted it is that I knew almost nothing about my grandparents, or what they did in life, or why they did it, or how they felt about the era in which they lived, or their family situation. And then I thought a little bit more deeply, and I said, how much do I really know about my parents? And the question was, not very much. I really didn't know how my father conducted his business. I didn't really know how my mother spent most of her time or her life, or dealt with her personal problems, or what my father's relation was to his father. And it's just an awful blank. And I found here in Broadmead, people of my age and in their 80s, I have often asked them, how much do you know about your grandparents? How much do you really know about your grandparents? And the answer is, not really very much. And then I go on and then I say, how much do you really know about your parents? And the more honest of them says what I say, not very much. And I say, it's a shame. I said, little did I know as a professional newspaper, did I ever sit down and say, why don't I interview my mother? Certainly, she was old enough and I was old enough to know I was a professional newspaper man. Mm-hmm. Why didn't I sit down and really ask her what her life was like as a teenager, or as a young married woman, or as an older woman, and why she made decisions that she did. And I never once asked her any of these personal questions. And I found that when I talked to women of my generations in a place like Broadmead, I find I have lots of compatriots, of women and men both, who didn't ask elementary questions about them. And so I said, maybe I should write something, a short memoir, at least describing what I did, so that my sons or my grandsons or my grandchildren or great-grandchildren might be curious what I was doing with my life in the long ago 19th century or 20th century or 21st century, when it becomes old-time history.
So we don't have much recording time left tonight. You've been at this for over 3.5 hours. Do you have specific thoughts along these lines that you'd like to share with the future generations that you'd like to say now? Because I know that you've been working on this memoir for a while, so what would you like to pass on?
Well, I find that as I look back on having survived 87 years, which is quite a remarkable thing in itself, is that life is really an unpredictable adventure. And so much of it depends on passing instances of turnings and decisions or happenstances or pivotal circumstances that change your life a lot more than you can possibly consider are examples of alter your whole life, such as the decision that I wound up in a college where they needed writers, and I wound up choosing to do something with my college life which changed overnight the whole direction of my life. I think the fact that you meet somebody that you're attracted to and suddenly you marry them, and your life and her life is changed in ways that are unpredictable, and of course you're creating lives of your children who would never have existed before, so that the element of chance of are so multiplicitous that you can't possibly consider how much chance and happenstance and rules your life. And all of us in the course of our lives become also come across examples where we could have been hurt or killed or afflicted by diseases that would have changed the way we had to live, are very, very, very mysterious, so that we're really fragile creatures subject to incredible numbers of chance, so that the whole adventure of life is very much a matter of enormous adventure and luck and bad luck and good luck, and that is very much of a mystery as you sit back and contemplate all the things that happen to you in the course of being on this planet.
Do you have any specific recommendations that you would like to provide people? Guiding principles?
Not very much, because I guess you might say I'm a bit of a fatalist, that things change, that an individual is so much a chance of the times he lives, the country he lives, the economic circumstances in which he lives, the intellectual milieu of the family in which he lives, the challenges he musters to fight or to accept or to it's so much chance, and it's so much a matter of chance that you just have to figure the things that you can control in life are
So in summary, this has been a fabulous conversation. What parting thoughts do you want to leave people with, or have you said it all?
That you have to assess yourself realistically and judge yourself realistically, and don't try to judge yourself too harshly or too benignly.
Okay, so I'd like to call forward here my two backup people for the videography. Joe and Henry, would you like to come out here so we can put you on tape? Because this is the production team, everybody, that put this together.
All right.
So you may, so,
Hello.
so
Yeah.
this is our production team. Post-production will be done by Joe, and we will be disseminating this in the near future to the entire extended family. So again, it's December 26th, 2015.
Thank you, boys.
We're in
Thank you,
Cockeysville,
Joe.
Maryland.
Thank you,
all.
Henry. And thank you, Rob.
Yep, thank you. And thanks for our rental equipment.
Yeah.
American politics